You have spent years identifying your trauma, naming your wounds, explaining your struggles through the lens of what was done to you, what you did not receive, how you were hurt or neglected or failed by the adults who were supposed to protect you. You have learned the language of attachment styles and adverse childhood experiences and developmental trauma, have found frameworks that explain why you are the way you are, have built entire identity around being a person who was damaged and is now healing from that damage. But you do not have trauma. You just never grew up. What you call trauma is often just the normal difficulties of childhood that every human experiences, the ordinary failures of imperfect parents, the standard disappointments and frustrations that are part of becoming a person. And what you call healing is actually avoiding the fundamental task you never completed, developing into psychologically mature adults who can regulate emotions, tolerate discomfort, take responsibility, delay gratification, and function in reality without demanding that reality accommodate your emotional needs. This is not about dismissing actual trauma or claiming that severe abuse and neglect do not create real wounds that require real healing. This is about recognizing that contemporary culture has pathologized normal development, has taught people to interpret ordinary childhood difficulties as traumatic injuries, has provided language that allows people to remain psychologically adolescent while claiming they are wounded adults working on their healing. You are not traumatized, you are immature, and the difference matters because the solutions are completely different. Understanding this requires examining what you are actually doing versus what you believe you are doing, what you are avoiding versus what you claim you are healing. You do not have trauma from your childhood. You have failure to develop emotional regulation that is normal adult capacity, and you are using trauma language to avoid admitting that you never learned to manage your feelings without requiring external management from others. Emotional regulation is developmental achievement that occurs through childhood and adolescence, when you gradually learn to tolerate uncomfortable emotions without falling apart, to experience feelings without being completely controlled by them, to have internal state shift without requiring immediate external intervention to make you feel better. But you never develop this capacity, remain stuck in childhood pattern of needing others to regulate you, to make your discomfort go away, to manage your emotional state because you cannot manage it yourself. And instead of recognizing this as developmental failure that needs to be addressed through actually building the capacity you lack, you call it trauma. You say you are triggered. You claim that your inability to handle normal emotional experiences is result of wounds that others inflicted, rather than recognizing it as skill you never developed. You feel anxious and you call this trauma response, when actually it is just anxiety, normal human emotion that adults learn to tolerate without catastrophizing or demanding that others remove the source of anxiety or provide constant reassurance. You feel sad and you cannot function, cannot do basic tasks, cannot show up to responsibilities, and you call this depression caused by trauma when actually it is inability to continue functioning while experiencing uncomfortable emotion, is failure to develop capacity to feel sad while still doing what needs to be done. You feel angry and you lash out, cannot control your reactions, say things you do not mean, behave in ways you later regret, and you call this trauma response or triggered reaction, when actually it is just poor emotional regulation, is behaving like a child who never learned that feeling angry does not excuse harmful behavior, that adults are responsible for how they express emotions regardless of how intensely they feel them. The emotion is not the problem. Your inability to experience emotion without being controlled by it is the problem. And this is not trauma. This is immaturity that you are refusing to address by claiming it is wound, rather than recognizing it is capacity you need to develop. You do not have trauma. You have inability to tolerate discomfort or frustration, and you are using trauma language to avoid admitting that you never developed adult capacity to experience things you do not like without falling apart, or demanding that others remove the discomfort. Frustration tolerance is fundamental developmental achievement, is capacity to want something and not get it without experiencing this as catastrophic, to be uncomfortable without requiring immediate relief, to have preferences that are not met without interpreting this as injury or attack. Children have low frustration tolerance, cannot wait, cannot handle not getting what they want, experience minor discomforts as unbearable. Adults develop capacity to tolerate frustration, to be uncomfortable without crisis, to have desires that go unmet without emotional collapse. But you never develop this capacity, remained at childhood level of needing immediate gratification, immediate relief from discomfort, immediate accommodation of your preferences. And instead of recognizing this as immaturity, you frame it as trauma response. You say you cannot tolerate certain situations because they are triggering. You claim that your need for immediate comfort and accommodation is legitimate self-care, rather than recognizing it as childish inability to handle normal life difficulties. You cannot handle being bored, so you call it understimulation and claim you need constant engagement. You cannot handle being tired, so you call it exhaustion and claim you need extensive rest. You cannot handle being slightly uncomfortable, so you call it intolerable conditions and claim you need immediate accommodation. You also cannot handle hearing no, cannot tolerate boundaries that others set with you, cannot accept that your wants do not automatically create obligations in others to meet those wants. When someone says no to your request or establishes limit with you, you experience this as rejection or abandonment or attack. You claim they are not respecting your needs. You frame their boundary as harm they are doing to you. This is childhood thinking, is inability to understand that others are separate people with their own needs and limits, is failure to develop adult capacity to hear no without experiencing it as catastrophic. The discomfort is not trauma. The frustration is not wound. The disappointment is not injury. These are normal human experiences that adults learn to tolerate without falling apart, without demanding that reality change to accommodate their preferences, without claiming that their inability to handle normal difficulties is a result of damage others inflicted rather than capacity they never developed. You do not have trauma, you have refusal to take responsibility for your behavior and its consequences, and you are using trauma language to avoid accountability by claiming that your actions are not really your fault, but are results of wounds that make you unable to control yourself or meet normal adult expectations. Responsibility is a core aspect of psychological maturity, is understanding that you are agents in your life, that your choices create consequences, that you are accountable for your behavior, regardless of how you feel or what you have experienced. But you avoid responsibility by framing everything through lens of trauma, by claiming that your behavior is trauma response that you cannot control, by demanding that others understand your limitations and excuse your failures and accommodate your inability to meet expectations. You do not show up reliably, and you call this trauma-related executive dysfunction rather than admitting you are irresponsible. You do not follow through on commitments, and you call this self-preservation or protecting your energy rather than admitting you make promises you do not keep. You treat people badly when you are upset, and you call this triggered reaction that is not your fault rather than admitting you behave poorly and need to develop better self-control. You fail to do basic adult tasks, and you call this depression or anxiety or neurodivergence rather than admitting you have not developed discipline or organization or follow-through. You create problems in relationships through your behavior, and you call this abandonment, wound, or attachment trauma, rather than admitting you are difficult to be in relationship with because you have not developed relational maturity. The trauma framing allows you to be victim of your own behavior, allows you to avoid facing that you are causing problems, allows you to demand that others accommodate your dysfunction rather than expecting yourself to develop capacity to function. You are not held back by trauma. You are held back by refusal to take responsibility, by insistence on remaining child who is not accountable for their actions, by using psychological language to avoid growing up and developing adult capacity for responsibility and accountability. This is not compassion. This is allowing you to remain immature by providing sophisticated language that makes the immaturity look like injury rather than recognizing it as developmental failure that requires you to do difficult work of actually developing the capacities you lack rather than demanding that world accommodate your lack of development. You do not have trauma. You have expectation that others should manage your emotions and accommodate your needs and provide endless patience for your inability to function like adult, and you are using trauma language to make these demands seem legitimate rather than recognizing them as childish expectation that others should parent you. Psychological maturity includes understanding that you are responsible for managing your own emotional state, that others are not obligated to regulate you or accommodate your sensitivities, or provide constant reassurance, or adjust their behavior to prevent you from being upset. But you demand that others treat you like a wounded child who needs special handling, demand that they walk on eggshells to avoid triggering you, demand that they provide emotional support and validation and accommodation, while you provide nothing in return because you are too busy healing to show up for others. You call this having boundaries or advocating for your needs, when actually it is demanding that relationships be entirely about you, that others do all the emotional labor while you take and justify the taking through trauma language. You demand that others regulate your emotions by providing constant reassurance that they are not angry, that they still love you, that you have not done something wrong. You demand that they manage their own emotions and expressions to avoid upsetting you, that they suppress their frustration or disappointment or needs, because your needs are more important, because you are traumatized. You demand that they accommodate your limitations while you refuse to stretch or grow or develop capacity to meet them halfway. This creates relationships where you are permanent child and others are permanent parents, where you take without giving, where your needs always take precedence, where others exist to manage and accommodate and support you while you remain focused entirely on yourself and your healing. And you justify this dynamic through trauma language, claim that you cannot do more because you are healing, that expecting reciprocity is not respecting your boundaries, that others should understand that you are wounded and therefore exempt from normal relational expectations. The expectation that others should parent you is not trauma response. It is immaturity. It is refusal to develop adult capacity for emotional self-management and reciprocal relationships. You are not wounded person who needs special treatment. You are adult who never grew up and is demanding that others enable your continued immaturity by providing parental care, while you avoid the work of actually becoming capable of adult functioning. You do not have trauma. You have inability to distinguish between consequences and abuse, between appropriate limits and cruelty, between reality's feedback and personal attack, and you are using trauma language to frame normal accountability as harm. Children experience consequences as punishments, experience limits as rejections, experience frustration as attack because they have not yet developed capacity to understand that other people's boundaries and reality's constraints are not personal injuries, but are normal aspects of living with others in world that does not revolve around their needs. Adults develop capacity to understand that when someone says no or sets limit or expresses frustration with your behavior, this is not abuse or attack, but is normal relational feedback or appropriate boundary. But you never develop this understanding, continue to experience any pushback or limit or consequence as if it is harm being done to you, continue to interpret appropriate accountability as abuse or cruelty or trauma. Someone expresses frustration with your behavior and you call this verbal abuse, when actually it is normal communication of legitimate frustration with something you did. Someone sets boundary with you about what they will or will not accommodate, and you call this abandonment, when actually it is appropriate limit setting. Someone holds you accountable for your commitments, and you call this unfair expectations, when actually it is normal expectation that adults do what they say they will do. You were given normal childhood responsibilities and you call this parentification when actually it was age-appropriate contribution to household. You were told no sometimes and you call this neglect when actually it was parents setting appropriate limits. You experienced normal childhood disappointments and you call this trauma when actually it was an ordinary part of growing up that was not supposed to damage you, but was supposed to teach you that you do not always get what you want, and this is not catastrophe. This inability to distinguish between harm and normal life difficulty means you are constantly finding evidence of trauma, constantly discovering new ways you were wounded, constantly explaining your dysfunction through lens of what was done to you, rather than recognizing that much of what you call trauma is actually just normal childhood experiences that you never integrated properly, that you never developed adult understanding of, that you continue to interpret through childhood lens of everything being about you and any discomfort being attack. You do not have trauma. You never developed adult capacities for delayed gratification, for tolerating boredom, for doing things you do not want to do, for functioning when you do not feel like it, for managing practical aspects of life, and you are using trauma language to avoid admitting that you lack basic competencies that adults are expected to possess. Maturity is not just emotional or psychological. It includes practical capacities, ability to organize your life, to manage time and money and responsibilities, to do boring necessary tasks, to function in sustained way rather than only when you feel motivated. But you cannot do these things, cannot manage basic adult responsibilities, cannot maintain organization or follow-through, cannot tolerate the boring work that adult life requires. And instead of recognizing this as failure to develop practical competence, you frame it through trauma. You say you have executive dysfunction from ADHD or depression or anxiety caused by childhood wounds. You claim your inability to function is symptom of damage, rather than admission that you never learned to function. You cannot hold job because you cannot tolerate boredom or authority or routine, and you call this capitalism trauma or toxic work environment when actually it is inability to do things you do not want to do for sustained periods. It is childish need for constant interest and autonomy and flexibility that adult life does not provide. You cannot manage money because you cannot delay gratification, and you call this scarcity mindset from childhood poverty when actually it is inability to save or plan or think beyond immediate desires. You cannot maintain basic life organization because you never developed systems or discipline, and you call this executive dysfunction when actually it is just disorganization and lack of follow-through. You cannot clean your space or do basic hygiene consistently because you cannot make yourself do things that are boring or unpleasant, and you call this depression or neurodivergence when actually it is immaturity, is living like teenager who is waiting for parent to make them do these things rather than adult who does them because they need to be done. The inability to function in practical ways is not trauma. It is failure to develop adult competence, and framing it as trauma keeps you from developing the capacities you lack because you are focused on healing wounds rather than building skills, on understanding why you cannot function rather than learning how to function regardless of your feelings about it. What actual psychological maturity requires is developing capacities you claim trauma prevents you from having ability to regulate your own emotions without requiring others to manage them for you, ability to tolerate discomfort and frustration without falling apart, ability to take responsibility for your behavior and its consequences, ability to understand that others are separate people with their own needs and limits, ability to distinguish between harm and normal life difficulty, ability to understand that others are separate people and mammon, end quote. Ability to do things you do not want to do because they need to be done, ability to function in sustained way rather than only when you feel like it. These are not special gifts that some people receive through easy childhoods. These are developmental achievements that occur through practice and experience and gradually building capacity through facing difficulty rather than avoiding it. And the irony is that using trauma framework to avoid developing these capacities ensures you remain stuck in exactly the immature state you claim is result of trauma, ensures you never grow up because you are too busy identifying as wounded to do actual work of developing adult functioning. Actual maturity means you can feel intense emotions without being controlled by them, can be deeply uncomfortable without requiring immediate relief, can face consequences for your actions without collapsing into self-pity, can hear no without experiencing it as rejection, can do boring necessary tasks without constant motivation, can maintain relationships where you give as much as you take, can exist in a world that does not revolve around your needs without interpreting this as harm. This maturity is not achieved through healing trauma, but through practicing the very capacities you avoid practicing, through tolerating the discomfort you avoid tolerating, through taking the responsibility you avoid taking, through developing the skills you claim you cannot develop because of your wounds. The trauma framework keeps you focused on why you cannot do these things rather than on how to develop capacity to do them. Keeps you identifying as victim of your past rather than as agent in your present and future. The work is not understanding your trauma. The work is growing up, is developing the adult capacities you never developed, is facing that you are immature, and that maturity is not something that happens to you, but something you actively build through doing difficult things you do not want to do until they become easier, through tolerating discomfort until your capacity to tolerate it increases, through functioning even when you do not feel like it, until functioning becomes habit rather than requiring constant emotional readiness. You do not have trauma, you just never grew up. You never developed emotional regulation, so you cannot manage your feelings without requiring others to manage them for you. You never developed frustration tolerance, so you cannot handle normal discomfort without falling apart or demanding accommodation. You never developed responsibility, so you avoid accountability by claiming your behavior is trauma response beyond your control. You never developed understanding that others are separate people, so you demand they parent you while you focus entirely on your own needs. You cannot distinguish between consequences and abuse, so you frame normal limits as harm. You never developed practical adult competencies, so you cannot function in a sustained way without constant motivation and support. And you use trauma language to make all of this seem like injury you suffered, rather than capacity you failed to develop. Use psychological frameworks to remain child, while claiming you are wounded adult who is healing. This is not dismissing real trauma or claiming severe abuse does not create genuine wounds. This is recognizing that contemporary culture has pathologized normal development, has taught people to interpret ordinary childhood difficulties as traumatic damage, has provided language that allows them to avoid growing up while claiming they are healing. The normal frustrations of imperfect parents, the normal disappointments of childhood, the normal challenges of becoming person in difficult world. These are not trauma, these are life, and learning to handle them is what maturity is. The path forward is not more trauma processing, not more understanding of your wounds, not more accommodation of your limitations. The path forward is developing the capacities you lack, is doing the difficult work of actually growing up, is building emotional regulation through practice, not through healing, is developing frustration tolerance through experiencing frustration, not through avoiding it, is becoming responsible through taking responsibility, not through understanding why you are not responsible. You are not traumatized. You are immature. And the difference matters, because the solution is not healing, it is growing up, is developing adult capacities through doing adult things, even when you do not feel ready, even when it is uncomfortable, even when you would rather remain child who is cared for, rather than adult who cares for themselves. Stop looking for wounds to heal and start building capacities to develop.